Hello, everybody. Alex Wiseman here, talking to you today about economic globalization. We are going to be looking at one of the versions of globalization that is, quite frankly, probably the one that most people think of when they think of globalization at all. And we will be trying to see what the readings that we've been looking at have said about that, and one in particular that I will highlight for you. We'll also be looking specifically at what we could do when we think about education related to economic globalization and whether or not there is any fit at all. A lot of the readings from the book this week's topic did not mention education explicitly. In fact, I don't think most of them did. And so we have to think about what do we do with that. The good news is that the readings from David Baker's book, The Schooled Society, did make the connection for us, at least in one way, and we can talk about what that means as we move forward. So, what is globalization? That's sort of the first question that we have to ask. And, we talked about many different definitions of it. We tried to contrast it with contextualization as part of the class so far. But what we're really left with is thinking about these three areas, these three broad areas. For economic globalization, we could just say quite frankly that there is no nation or community or economy that is isolated from others. It just doesn't happen. And I'm not sure that this is something that has happened now that wasn't happening earlier, although the ways that it happens now perhaps are accelerated and facilitated in a way by technology and other developments that it has never been done in the past. That's certainly true. But we know that national economies tend to influence each other. They tend to have an impact on what others are doing. Maybe one country that is very wealthy or has a lot of resources will invest in another country that is low on resources or is very poor, or will loan or will produce things in that country that they might not produce in their own because of different costs for raw materials and labor and those sorts of things. Or one country might have more technology than another and sell to the other countries. There are all sorts of ways that these different products and services and labor issues can be made that would affect the way that national economies interact with one another. And there are lots of different ways that this is talked about. I'm certainly not talking about it as an expert in economics or anything like that. So the terms that I use are probably not going to be, certainly not the terms that were used in the readings from this week, because they're much more attuned to the proper terminology. However, globalization and the ways that these economic resources or services or goods or other sorts of things are exchanged, that I understand. Right? That's the globalization part that I can get at. And so that's really what we're talking about today. How does economic globalization, how does this exchange of labor, goods, services, and people happen in a way that influences national economies, and what are some of the characteristics of that economic globalization, and how do they interact with one another? And we can compare that with the cultural and the political versions of globalization. So we've talked about this, quite frankly, a lot when we talk about education, because culture itself is kind of a commodity, right? And it is embedded into the literature that people read, the books that people read, the music that people listen to, the ways that we talk about interacting with one another, the kinds of structures and organizations and ideologies that are embedded in particular, our education systems and the ways that we go about that. So cultural globalization is something that is much more readily visible, especially to those of us who think about education and the way that education is involved in globalization. Now, we know a couple of things from other readings and certainly from other classes. One is that culture flows largely from what we call the global north to the global south, or in the words of a recent New York Times editorial piece, the fat economies to the lean economies. Right? And so we'll see that there is a big influx of media and of business structures and of ideologies and of traditions and all sorts of things from the global north or the west, and I'm using big air quotes here, to the global south or other countries that are not in that sort of economic and cultural west. So, for example, well, I've already given you some examples. Okay. Then we have political globalization. And political globalization is certainly also very important. Not something that we have talked about quite as much in this class so far, although I think that will be changing when you look at the books that each of your groups are developing for discussion. But we can talk about things like the United Nations. We can talk about before that, the League of Nations. We can talk about ways that regional organizations develop, like the European Union or the I can't remember, ASEAN. See, I'm blanking on what that stands for right now. And the EU and all sorts of others that combine different countries together in regional associations. We can also talk about political globalization when we talk about organizations like the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization or the World Bank, which would kind of combine both of those. Right? So there are different ways of thinking about it, but the idea is that political systems are influencing one another. Even though member states of each of these organizations might be sovereign, they have they have obligations and commitments to each other. That means that they integrate with one another and they embed one another with political perspectives, ideologies, traditions that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise do. Okay? So we have economic, cultural, and political globalization. We see cultural being very easily tied to education. Political is something we talk about quite a bit. I mean, we have a whole class on issues and institutions and education, which looks at some of these sorts of organizations. We have another one specifically on the UN. We don't often talk about economic globalization in the same way. However, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the form of globalization I think is most readily and stereotypically associated with the term globalization. So then we're left with the question, where does education fit into all of this? Not just in the cultural, but where does it fit in the economic globalization? Where does it fit in the political globalization? Right? We have to come to some sort of understanding. Well, as we already mentioned, we're talking specifically about economic globalization this week, and although there were many readings that I thought were helpful and interesting from the Lechner and Boley globalization reader, I thought that the section by R.H. Wade was actually one of the most interesting and relevant, and I'll explain why I think that was interesting as we go along. It's the section called Is Globalization Reducing Poverty and Inequality? And in this section, he takes really, I think, one of the most interesting standpoints because he's not going all the way to the left, he's not going all the way to the right, he's not going, to either extreme. He's trying to say, hey, we can take a look at what's going on, we can take a look at what some of the expectations are about economic globalization, and we can fit those together in a way that maybe other people haven't done. And so what Wade does is he starts by setting out what he's referring to as the neoliberal argument, and then he sets out what he thinks is the left's argument, and then he has a set of propositions that he works us through to come up with his own sort of middle ground. And that's the part that I think is really interesting. So if you looked at the globalization reader and you started on page 187, because that's where this comes from, this is the very first part. These are the first. This is the first sentence, I guess, from the section. And let me read through this with you. He says the neoliberal argument says that the distribution of income between all the world's people has become more equal over the past 2 decades, and the number of people living in extreme poverty has fallen for the first time in more than a century and a half. All right, so in this very first section, we have his summary that the neoliberal argument says that distribution of income has become more equal worldwide. He goes on to say that it says that these progressive trends are due in large part to the rising density of economic integration between countries, which is made for rising efficiency of resource use worldwide as countries and regions specialize in line with their comparative advantage. All right? So, progressive trends and the rising density of economic integration between countries. So this economic integration between countries, that is our economic globalization, right? So the idea from R.H. Wade, from Robert Wade, is that this neoliberal argument says that income distribution has equalized as a result of economic integration between countries. I think that's a pretty fair summary, I think, of the neoliberal argument. Now, you might ask, or maybe you already know, what is neoliberalism? And I think that's important to address here. You've heard, if you've had other classes at Lehigh or in our program, you've certainly heard a lot of discussion of neoliberalism. If you go to a conference or any other place where people like us congregate, you will hear a lot of discussion of neoliberalism. It's often a very critical discussion, although not always. Those who don't talk about neoliberalism tend to have other versions that those who oppose neoliberalism will then label. It gets confusing. Anyway, what I thought I'd do is I often try to just sort of lay out a basic argument for what neoliberalism is and how we can think about it, which I think contrasts a little bit with some of my colleagues that you might also be working with either in this program or outside of this program, but in the comparative and international education field in general. Now let me say that I really like, if you look at this web address down here, I really like this. It's a primer on neoliberalism, right? It's a introduction to neoliberalism that's on this page. This is a website that leans to the left, so you know that you're getting that bias when you look at it, and I think that's okay because I think they do a fairly good job of laying out that they are coming from a more of a left perspective, that they are critical of neoliberalism, but they do a nice job also of sort of defining it. And so when thinking about how to summarize the idea for students, especially since everyone is so web savvy, I find that a resource like this can be very helpful. You may have others that you've looked at for other classes or readings or books that you've looked at that you might also like as well. So please feel free to complement this discussion with your own resources. So I'm quoting from this website here, and then I want to quote it and then I want to talk about it. So I summarized from What is Neoliberalism, which a brief definition for activists by Elizabeth Martinez and Arnoldo Garcia from Corporate Watch. The main points of neoliberalism include the rule of the market. This is the idea that freedom for capital, goods, and services where the market is self-regulating, allowing the trickle-down notion of wealth distribution. It also includes the de-unionizing of labor forces and removals of any impediments to capital mobility such as regulations. The freedom is from the state or government. So this is the idea of a free market, free of regulation, free of any sort of controls. The idea is that the market will balance itself. If we let it go, then it will balance itself. And that the market is the ultimate decider, to use a Bushism, for what is good in terms of economic development, growth, etc. Now, how does this actually happen? Well, or what are some of the effects? One is reducing public expenditure for social services, such as health and education, by the government. So neoliberalism, or a neoliberal approach, would argue that reducing public expenditure for these sorts of social services from the government will actually free up the market to regulate itself. The market will then be free to determine what is the best education, for example, that can be offered. I'm giving a very positive spin to neoliberalism here, right? Another characteristic to consider is deregulation, which I've already explained allows market forces to act as a self-regulating mechanism. In this case, the market itself is not beholden to any other entity. Privatization of public enterprise and changing perceptions of what is a public and community good is all part of this as well. We're going to pause here. We're going to come back in part 2. I hope you'll still be with me.